Good morning and welcome to day 2 of EVA BC's Fall 2021 Training Forum. My name is Kate Rossiter and I'm the Senior Manager of Provincial Services at EVA BC. I'm a queer white settler with English, Scottish and Irish ancestry, and I've been with EVA BC for about the past 6.5 years. Before we begin, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that EVA BC's main office is located on the traditional, ancestral and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We are so grateful to be able to do our work to support community-based anti-violence programs and cross-sectoral initiatives across BC on these lands. We recognize our responsibilities to support the implementation of the calls to action and the calls for justice, and to continue learning from a place of humility. It's a privilege to be hosting and learning alongside you this week, and I look forward to connecting with many of you throughout the year. I also want to acknowledge that many communities have been impacted by flooding, and with more heavy rains this week and over the weekend, many of you will be preparing for additional impacts in your communities. We thank you for continuing to do your best to support survivors through these challenging times. Today, November 25th, is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. It is also the start of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And this year marks the 30th anniversary of this global effort to raise awareness about gender-based violence and efforts to eliminate violence against women and girls and two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people. If you follow us on social media over the next 16 days, you will learn more about several initiatives underway as part of this international campaign. Please also take the time to look at what's happening in your community and online. Just a couple of reminders. We encourage you to prioritize your wellness and to visit the Wellness Center for access to some additional resources and information for connecting to supports. If you have any tech questions or difficulties, please email atf@endingviolence.org and a member of our team will be happy to assist you. Before we move into this morning's sessions, EVA BC would like to take a moment to honor the recent loss of colleagues who have made significant contributions to the anti-violence community. To share some thoughts on behalf of EVA BC and our board of directors, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Habiba Rashid, EVA BC's Senior Manager of Finance and Administration.
Thank you, Kate. Good morning, everyone. We would like to take a moment now to honor all the social justice and anti-violence advocates who have passed away this year, including the recent passing of Sarah Robinson and Lillian Howard, who were passionate advocates for Indigenous women and worked tirelessly to address gender-based violence and discrimination against Indigenous peoples in BC. On behalf of the Ending Violence Association of BC's board and staff, we also want to take a few minutes to acknowledge two advocates who worked closely with EVA BC, Jan Seelinger and Shashi Asanan. Jan Seelinger served as a director on the EVA BC board representing Region 5 Interior for over 10 years. Today, especially, I feel the loss of Jan as I recall for many years, she was a bright presence, often taking on the role of the MC and lending her presence and energy to our events. Jan worked as a program coordinator for Safe Society and Salmon Arm for 13 years. She was well known in her community for her passion for anti-violence work and was often invited to speak at events. Jan brought EVA BC's Be More Than a Bystander program to the region, took the lead in a local Purple Lights campaign, and participated in many anti-violence vigils. She also helped co-facilitate the RCMP's youth training in schools on the topic of drug-facilitated sexual assault. The Safe Society is creating a Serenity Garden in Jan's name that will include a gazebo and water feature. EVA BC shares the loss and extends condolences to her son and all who knew her. EVA BC also shares the sadness across the anti-violence sector in the passing of a highly respected community leader, Shashi Asanan. In 1991, Shashi Asanan founded the Vancouver and Lower Mainland Multicultural Family Support Services Society, a nonprofit organization that offers free and confidential services to immigrant, visible minority, refugee, and women without immigration status and their families who are experiencing family violence. Shashi went on to lead the organization as its executive director for the next 26 years. Her work brought her many honors, including YWCA's Women of Distinction Award, an honorary doctorate from the UBC, and the province's highest recognition with the Order of BC. Shashi was interviewed numerous times by the Indo-Canadian Voice since the mid-1990s, and she wrote several articles for this newspaper. Her courageous stand against violence against women immensely helped South Asian and other visible minorities. Shashi also closely collaborated with EVA BC, serving as a valued member of EVA BC's Community Coordination for Women's Safety, known as CCWS Working Group, for decades until 2018, and was a key member of a project team for the safety of immigrant, refugee, and non-status women project. The Vancouver and Lower Mainland Multicultural Family Support Services Society has invited those who remember Shashi to leave their thoughts and comments on a We Remember page. Please take a moment to visit our In Memoriam page on the Training Forum platform to read our complete acknowledgement to Jan Seelinger and Shashi Asanan. Thank you.
Thank you, Habiba, for this message on behalf of UBC and the board. For participants in the training forum this morning, the chat will remain open for a few minutes, and we will be collecting any messages shared in the chat with the families of those who've lost their family members this year. I'd now like to share a message from MLA Grace Lohr, British Columbia's Parliamentary Secretary for Gender Equity. P.S. Grace Lohr was elected the MLA for Victoria Beacon Hill in 2020. She has been a dedicated anti-violence advocate, working closely with the Victoria Sexual Assault Centre and other anti-violence organizations to support inclusive, accessible, and survivor-centered sexual response. Welcome.
Hi everyone, my name is Grace Lohr and my pronouns are she and her. I'm honored to join you today from my office on the territory of the Lekwungen peoples of the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today as Parliamentary Secretary for Gender Equity. Today marks the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and the start of the 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. These 16 days are a rallying cry for action to end violence against women, girls, two-spirit, transgender, and non-binary people. It is so important that EVA BC has brought you all together to share your experiences and to learn from each other. You represent those who are on the front lines of some of the most important and challenging work in our province. Sexual assault and violence remains all too prevalent, with devastating and long-lasting effects for survivors and their communities. This danger has only increased during this time of provincial emergencies. It's often during a crisis when we come face to face with the very worst of society and also the very best. All of you here support those who have faced violence and unimaginable harm. Your work and your compassion for others is inspiring and motivating. Every day, people like yourselves bravely step forward to break the cycle of domestic violence, the silence around sexual assault, and other forms of violence. Like all of you, I recognize the suffering of the many thousands of people who face violence and sexual assault in our province. While gender-based violence occurs in all communities and cultures, we know Indigenous women and girls, racialized people, trans people, and others in the 2S LGBTQ+ community, as well as those with disabilities and newcomers to our country, are at the greatest risk of being targeted. Everyone deserves to feel safe in our province. Our family members, friends, colleagues, our neighbors must not have to worry about their safety getting home or being at home. The safety and well-being of all people depend on us taking action to help end gender-based violence and make our province safer. I'll be back later today to give you more of an update on our commitment to developing an action plan to end gender-based violence and to ensure survivors of violence can access the care they need. I want to acknowledge the team at EVA BC for all their work in bringing people together. I hope your conference and your time together affirms the fact that you are all part of an incredible team who are making a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, PS Laura. Parliamentary Secretary Laura wanted to ensure that she could share this message with you all to start us off this morning. She will also be joining us at the end of the networking session just before lunch to have an opportunity to connect with you all in real time. We'll also be doing some door prizes before lunch, and we invite you to visit the funders and prize sponsors page for more information about the prizes we'll be drawing. It's now my absolute pleasure to introduce Vicki Reynolds, who will be well known to many of you. Vicki is an activist and therapist who works to bridge the worlds of social justice activism with community work and therapy. Vicki is a white settler on the territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. Vicki's people are Irish, Newfoundland, and English folks, and she is a heterosexual woman with cisgender privilege. Her experience includes supervision and therapy with peers and other workers responding to the opioid catastrophe, refugees and survivors of torture, including Indigenous people who have survived residential schools and other state violence, sexualized violence counselors, mental health and substance misuse counselors, housing and shelter workers, activists, and those working alongside gender and sexually diverse communities. Vicki is an adjunct professor and has written and presented internationally. This morning, Vicki will be speaking to solidarity, sustainability, and resistance in responding to gender-based violence. We have dedicated some time at the end for questions. Please share any questions you have with Vicki at any time during her keynote presentation in the Q&A section to the right of this video, and we'll pose some of those questions to her at the end of her talk. Welcome, Vicki.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I am so honored to be here. That's really wonderful. I have great respect for Eva, the work you're doing, but all the community organizers who are present as well. Thanks so much for carving out part of your day to be with me and talk about this. So I'm going to be talking about solidarity, sustainability, and resistance. And all of this work in our responding to gender-based violence. I've written a lot about this stuff. My website's got videos and articles and stuff, but everything that I'm bringing forward doesn't come because I have a PhD and I'm a professor. It's all from collaboration. You know, I come with great humility to this work. I've been resisting gender-based violence and sexualized assault probably all of my life, like all of us. And I have learned so much from everybody who has laterally mentored me at many different locations, and most especially from all of the people who have been called clients who I have seen over the last like 40 years. So I just want to acknowledge that those are the people that are responsible for this. So I want to first begin by acknowledging Indigenous territory. All of the work that I do comes from me standing on the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I love this welcome. It's from a zine written alongside Riel Dupley Rossi and Charlene Helson called Decolonizing the Nonprofit Sector. And I love this kind of a welcome. Here is a fierce, young, feminine identified, I believe, Indigenous person speaking truth to power through the bloody fist over their hand that's trying to silence them. This is the kind of welcome I want. And I'm honored to be in solidarity with those folks. I don't think anything in Canada can go forward without stopping ourselves dead in our tracks, acknowledging the undocumented and unmarked graves. You know, in the spring, 215 bodies were found of children in the Tecumloops to Sowetan residential school. Again, Kathy Richardson, Indigenous scholar, says these should never have been called schools. They were concentration camps. We are now at a point, I believe, where to not acknowledge the violence of this and the genocide involved in this is to be a genocide denier. And although that number started at 215 bodies, it is now, of course, in the thousands. And this is, I just want to honor all of the Indigenous families and communities who have been working so hard to bring their children's bodies home, to hold up their communities to this. I also want to honor every person who died in these institutions, and I want to honor every person who survived. And I don't want to center Canadian, European responses to this, but just to always center Indigenous people in this, and to make everything start from this place, especially when we're talking about responding to violence. In all the work that I do, I talk about my work as a decolonizing practice and trying to be justice doing. When I talk about this, I really think about my work as an anti-perfection project. And what I mean by that is that I believe perfectionism is an enactment of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. You know, that vortex of doom, when you have to get everything perfect and you can't say anything until you know that you're right. You know, let's be open for critique, let's be messy, but let's respond to oppression with action and not just with more research and more tables, you know? When I talk about a decolonizing practice, I'm really informed in my work against gender-based violence by Sarah Hunt, who is Kwakiwak Nation, an Indigenous scholar and a professor. Her work talking about decolonizing rape culture has absolutely been informative and unsettling for me as a white settler. And I think that we must understand how the sector of gender-based violence is interwoven with colonialism. All of our institutions are wrapped around patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, and colonization, and how these are actually the roots of our work. I need to start here as a white settler to understand that this work is always happening on the backs of Indigenous women, Two-Spirit people, and girls. And to also acknowledge that there is absolutely nothing new about rape culture. As Sarah Hunt speaks about, the rape of the land and the taking of all the land for colonialism required the assault of women, that this is not something that happened as an after effect. This was the plan. And I think because I am a white settler, I work very hard to stay implicated in the ongoing catastrophes of white supremacy, colonization, and genocide. And that's the nature of white privilege and all of these forces, is that if I choose to ignore them, I just can't. And so I need to work to stay implicated, right? And I'm really interested in Eve Tuck's ideas about settler moves to innocence. So I've already started by telling you that I wrote a decolonizing handbook with two amazing Indigenous people. That's a settler move to innocence. It's to say to you, oh, look, yeah, I'm white and everything, but hey, Indigenous people who are really important, you know, collaborate with me. So I'm one of the good ones. And Eve Tuck would say, Vicki Reynolds, you're not one of the good ones. And it's not actually about you. Like, what we're looking for is collective accountability, right? I'm not innocent or a good settler. I acknowledge how colonialism and white supremacy have given me access to power to address gender-based violence. And I need to dismantle this in all of my organizing. And we need to look at this in all of the ways that we organize and our organizations, or we will replicate this, right? My work in terms of justice doing, I think this comes from the an activist orientation. A lot of my work is trying to move the work from social justice movements into the stuff that gets called community work. When I talk about justice doing, I'm talking about responding to people with respect and dignity, refusing to accommodate people to suffering. So much of the trauma industry is about, you know, getting a woman alone in a room, giving her a treatment or something, dealing with her symptoms of trauma, and throwing her back out into rape culture, into what Bell Hooks talks about as a wider culture of violence. We don't want to accommodate people to suffering, right? We want to use our collective power to change the systems of oppression that cause suffering. This requires us to resist professionalism, objectivity, and neutrality, and take up a stance for activism. So as I'm, you know, I have respect for your ethical stance as I'm laying out mine. And, you know, I invite you to look for points of connection, but also important differences. We don't want to annihilate our important differences, right? I think, you know, so often as a professor, I'm asked about what we're responding to in terms of seeing women as broken somehow on the inside, women, Two-Spirit people, trans women, and other gender folks who've been sexually assaulted, right? And experienced gender-based violence, that, you know, that they're somehow broken on the inside and that the issue is addiction, mental illness, and trauma. I don't think that's what we're responding to. We are responding to mean and hate-filled politics. If we look at this list of things that's being addressed in our communities, COVID and the pandemic is getting the most resources and the most attention. This is totally covering up the opiate catastrophe. In our province of British Columbia, 7 people are dying every day of something that's just the drug war. It's just killing drug policies, right? And this, of course, overshadows the gendered violence that is always happening and the white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. This is all happening on Indigenous territory where we've had genocide, and we have continually, as Sarah Hunt's talking about, since contact, missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. And we need to flip this on its head, right? Make things right first around responding to genocide. I'm informed by Judith Butler, queer theorist and amazing human being, who's written one book called Precarious Life, which was a response in the United States to 9/11, and talking about the powers of mourning and violence in terms of whose lives are worth mourning, right? And the fact that I know that we are in the midst of necropolitics. Necropolitics being the subjugation of life to the power of death, policies that actually kill, And so I look at things like the defunding of the overdose prevention sites for a while in the province of Alberta. To take money off of an overdose prevention site is actually, it's necropolitics. It's actually a policy that kills drug users, right? And this thinking comes from the work of Achille and Bembe, and I want to honor them in that teaching. But also ideas of structural abandonment. So often in my career, the heartbreak, where your heart is on the ground from people who have died, women who have died, girls, Two-Spirit people who've died, this language that they've slipped through the cracks or that there were gaps in services. This is language that hides violence. What these folks have died of is structural abandonment. We know what the answers are, and we're refusing to do it as a nation, right? No one is slipping through any cracks. They're big gaping holes that we've created, right? In a mean society. And I also just want to acknowledge that we're never not responding to gender-based violence. This is a picture about an amazing crew of a diversity of women at Sister Space, the overdose prevention site of Atira. I've just been so honored and humbled to be connected with these women. Sister Space is by and for women who are drug users, and many are involved in sex work. Many people have criminalized histories, are homeless, and struggle with poverty and police violence. These are the women, diversity of women who are over-policed and underprotected. But although this is an overdose prevention site, we know this is a rape crisis center. We are always responding to gender-based violence, even if the name says that what we're responding to is the opiate catastrophe. These things are always interconnected, right? And then I think about state violence and police violence. And in just a one short period in 2020, in a 3-month period, 6 different people were shot dead by police in Canada on mental wellness checks. What are the police doing mental wellness checks? When we call to defund the police, this is one of the first things we need to end. Why is a person struggling with, quote, mental illness responded to with people with guns? Is this a situation that requires a gun? In fact, all of the people who were shot dead in that 3-month period were racialized people, one of whom was Chantel Moore, a young Indigenous woman whose partner called and said he was worried for her mental health. More than one police officer arrived at her apartment. She's a young, small Indigenous woman, and they shot her dead. They were unable to keep themselves safe from her because of apparently her mental illness struggle, despite the fact she had no weapon. When the head of the RCMP was asked about this as systemic racism, because no white people had been shot during mental wellness checks during this time, the head of the RCMP, Commissioner Leckie, said that there's no systemic racism in the RCMP. This is gaslighting. The RCMP was structured around systemic racism. The reason there's a buffalo in that logo is a mystery, because the RCMP was partially responsible for destroying the buffalo so that Indigenous people were starving on the plains and had to get off the lands. Like all of this systemic racism is part of the gaslighting and the context of gender-based violence. I'm really inspired by Black Lives Matter, and this is an uprising. In terms of social movement theory, it's not just a social movement, but an uprising because it's actually creating change, right? Social change. In the United Kingdom, England, they responded to the movement of Black Lives Matter by having a royal commission. So in 2021, they published their commission findings, and they found that there was no systemic racism in the UK. They went so far as to say that it is a model white majority country. This is amazing, given the statistics that Black people in the UK suffer more violence from the state and are incarcerated at higher levels. When he was asked about this, the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, said that Black people make poor life choices. Wow. This is quite a different approach than Dean Spade, a critical trans theorist and lawyer, who says oppressed people have limited life choices, right? And I'm thinking about these interlocking systemic oppressions. This is at a Black Lives Matter event that happened in Ucluelet, and these Indigenous folks are holding up signs saying, Chantel Moore, George Floyd. Of course, George Floyd is the Black man who was lynched in the middle of the day in the United States by a white police officer. And just that sign, Chantel Moore, Indigenous woman shot dead in Canada on a mental wellness check, George Floyd, lynched in the middle of the day by a white police officer, that shows this solidarity and these cultures of resistance to this. I also remind myself that these people are wearing their regalia that 100 years ago would have been illegal on those territories. Just the existence of that drum today and those songs, this is a culture of resistance. So we're always up against this systemic interlocking oppression. And I'm informed by, of course, Angela Davis talking about abolition and a decarceral feminist approach. You know, Angela Davis was a political prisoner in prison. And she teaches that we must always resist the prison industrial complex in our organizing and in our responses to gender-based violence, right? And she's bringing an intersection of gender, race, and class analysis to this understanding. And on the edge of my knowing, I'm informed by someone I have worked alongside, Felix Gilliland, who identifies as a trans person and a feminist, saying that, you know, a queered anti-violence movement, you know, feminists can make repair with trans people by using the principles of a queered anti-violence movement. And I'm inspired by where we are moving in good ways in this kind of accountability when we're addressing gender-based violence. When it comes to staying alive in this work, even though I'm a trauma therapist and have a PhD in that, you know, I don't think that what we're up against is vicarious trauma or burnout or anything the trauma industry is telling us about. I don't think the problem's in our brain. I think the problem's in the real world. And I think the answer is about staying ethical. What I have found across time is if we are able to stay ethical, even though we are heartbroken and our hearts might be on the ground, we can still have sustainability. It's something very different than not burning out. Sustainability is about an ongoing aliveness, a genuine connectedness with people, and a spirited presence. You know, the fact that we are still open to making ourselves available to people who are suffering such oppression and that our hearts might break again. The point is not to not have a broken heart. The point is to be able to show up in the work and have clients be at the center, right? So I believe that, you know, that sustainability, that's so much more than just resisting vicarious trauma. That sustainability is possible if we stay ethical. It also brings the possibility of vicarious resistance and transformation. Thinking so much more than what the trauma industry is telling us about in terms of clients infecting us with hopelessness and the fact that our work hurts us. How does your work make your life better? My work and my participation with people who have suffered gender-based violence has transformed me, informed me, pushed me, made me a better activist, teacher, lover, friend, right? But if we are unable to deliver ethics to people, if we are in systems that require us to do things that are unethical, then what we're going to experience is spiritual pain, right? And that spiritual pain, that ethical pain, is an experience that says, here's the ethics and the heart of my work. Here's the things that matter to me. Autonomy, having, you know, women, non-binary people and girls be able to make their own choices. And yet here are policies that require, you know, reporting things to the police when someone didn't want that, things like this. You know, when we're in those situations where we're actually acting against the very values and principles and ethics at the heart of our work, like the autonomy for survivors, you know, that they get to make their own choices and then they get into these systems. You know, what we feel then is not burnout, and that client didn't infect us with hopelessness. What we're experiencing is a spiritual pain or an ethical pain, right? And while I think, self-care is absolutely essential, it's essentially inadequate. I do 3 minutes of plank every morning. I stretch, I drink decaf coffee. Man, I do try to do so many things to make sure I'm embodied. That's my responsibility. I take it very seriously. I think self-care, I take it very seriously, but self-care does not do anything about the social context of harm, about gender-based violence. All the plank that I do doesn't create any housing for women, right? And what I think about is that self-care is absolutely essential because I need to do that to get embodied, to get myself out of the way so it can just be about the women that I'm seeing. What I'm interested in is collective care and solidarity. Solidarity is never about unity. It's looking for points of connection with other people, right? Driven by the same ethics that we hold collectively, our collective ethics for justice doing. And I think about our collective care strategies, right? Who and what shoulders you up? What mutual aid projects, as Dean Spade would talk about, or what solidarity teams do you have? Who's your person you can howl at the moon with? That's from my work. If you're interested on that, that stuff's all on my website. But what are our collective care strategies? How do we invite each other to the warmth of a fire? And how do we stay ethical with each other and accountable, keeping each other ethical? And I'm thinking here about Richard Day, direct action activist ideas of groundless solidarity and infinite responsibility. The idea that in every interaction that I'm in, I'm trying to think about who am I not in solidarity with in this context? What powers am I holding? And what privileges am I standing on? Who am I on whose shoulders am I standing to be able to do gender-based violence work, right? To be able to respond to this, because our organizations and systems, we're not outside of this. We're not the good and the innocent, right? We are replicating these things unless we resist them. I was really inspired to see this Black woman carrying this sign at a Black Lives Matter protest, and I asked her permission to take this picture and use it. Respect my existence or expect my resistance. And I am so informed by I've worked with survivors of torture for decades at rape crisis centers, but what I'm interested in is not the trauma, but the acts of resistance of the person. Whenever people are oppressed, they resist. And so I think about these understandings of resistance because as movements, this is how we stay alive and useful. Wherever there's oppression, there's always resistance, right? And resistance ought not to be judged by its ability to stop oppression, because often it can't. But resistance is important for its ability to maintain a connection to humanity. And I'm informed here and have worked alongside Alan Wade and response-based therapists in these kind of ideas. But for me, I'm always interested in how the person resisted oppression. Like, what were the acts of resistance that we have as a movement? How are we actually in full out resistance against gender-based violence? And I'm thinking about the gaslighting that we are all subjected to just continually. This idea that gender-based violence doesn't exist, that these are all just individual situations, that we don't need to look at the policing structures, that man camps, that's language you can't use. You have, so I just think about our solidarity and our collective resistance, right? I think that this conference by Eva, we were just talking about what a shame it is we're not all together in a building and that we're not waiting in line to take a pee, because then we talk to each other and we inspire each other, we shoulder each other up, and we create an ethical container that can hold the tender pieces of our broken hearts up together. That is solidarity and that is collective resistance, right? But I think about this conference and these conversations as sanity-making projects. You can't make yourself sane. You can't resist burnout on your own. You need to do that with collective action, but you can't resist gaslighting on your own. You need witnesses to remind you, you're not crazy. We're not making this stuff up, right? Very much. This is part of our collective care. This is a sanity-making project. And I'm also informed by these ideas of revolutionary love. This comes from the teaching of Paulo Freire, popular education movement from South America. And, this idea of revolutionary love, a commitment to others and solidarity with their cause. I often tell people, you know, I have a PhD in 27 years of school, and I never had any professor ever talk about love. The only way love was talked about was mistaken love. You know, that women with battered women syndrome, women were looking for men who would abuse them because that was their pattern as women, right? Love was only talked about as something women didn't understand. But I believe that the heart of our work and the connective tissue of our movement is solidarity and love. You know, that's the stuff that keeps us together. And that's the stuff that can hold us together, you know, through the future. I also believe that in terms of resisting burnout, solidarity, shouldering each other up, it's our work to be the bringers of hope. You know, one of the quotes about vicarious trauma I don't like very much is this idea that clients infect us with their hopelessness. Whose job is it to bring hope to the helping relationship? I think that's our job. I think we have to do the work to have a life that has possibilities of us bringing hope to others, right? Not as optimism, not as positivity, but believed in hope, right? It's our job to do the hard work of seeing actual signs of justice doing that bring a believed in hope. This, I believe, is like an ethical position that's required for us. So I'm going to read you a story. And this is a story of something that really happened. And I want to start by thanking Sarah Ann Mitchell very much, a young Indigenous mother, for allowing me to share her story. And she wanted me to use her name. So here's a story of believed in hope in unexpected places. I had just returned from a cross-country tour speaking about the opiate catastrophe and trying to promote harm reduction and dignity-driven practice among many communities in Canada. I was exhausted and stretched. I had a desperate call to meet with a team of Aboriginal workers who were working alongside Aboriginal mothers to help them navigate the oppressive structures required to maintain their housing and resist the apprehension of their children. I was honored to be invited in, and despite the jet lag and being very tired, I knew I had to respond with action and showing up. People who've survived torture and political violence have taught me over the decades that the worst thing is not the torture itself, nor the need to seek refuge and leave their homelands. The real torture is living without your children. And we know that Canada has more children in the quote care of the state now than during the period of residential schools. This happens two ways: from the incarceration of Indigenous women and apprehensions around poverty, right? But so to enact my commitment to trying to have a decolonizing stance, I knew I needed to respond to this team of Aboriginal workers and the mother-led families that they support. But I wasn't just tired, I was also devastated. I'm also connected to a team working in a live-in program of youth of all genders struggling with substances, exploitation, and oppression in their lives. A youth who was in the program the previous year had died this day of an overdose. This youth died because recovery is not linear and because there was no overdose prevention site in their community. The team was overwhelmed with grief. I was trying to respond on many fronts. It was a long, dark, sleepless night. I awake fitfully, and as I'm preparing to meet with the Aboriginal workers, I'm straining to be the bringer of hope. I do my self-care practices of plank and stretching as I try to become embodied. I drink decaffeinated coffee and water. The program's workers are dedicated and skilled, but they have also caused harm to each other and to the Aboriginal mothers. I have no prior relationships with these workers, and I'm very aware that I'm yet another white woman professional showing up with a PhD and prestige bolstered with white supremacy. Hope is hard to find. I arrive early and over-prepared. To my surprise, I am met with a circle of about 15 workers, all earlier than me, and they are nearing the end of a smudge ceremony. They are already enacting the willingness and vulnerability I will need to be able to invite responsibility and enact repair, which gives my believed in hope a place to start. A young worker approaches me and non-verbally invites me to smudge. I am hesitant to engage in spiritual practices not my own, but I've also been mentored to participate accountably when invited into sacred spaces and to be careful what I take out. When the young worker has finished brushing me down with the eagle feather, she puts everything aside. Then she comes up to me and says kindly, "Do you know who I am?" I say she's familiar, but I don't remember where we know each other from or her name. She says, "You were my therapist on the team where we've just lost the youth to the opiate catastrophe." She said, "You saved my life." She introduced herself as Sarah Ann Mitchell, which is her real name that she wants acknowledged. And she tells me she is 20 years free from drugs and that our program and workers are part of her getting her life together. She also says she has 5 children and none of them are apprehended by the government. I feel elated, joyful, full of hope. I ask if we can take a selfie on my phone, and we do. I send it to the Youth Substance Misuse Program, where the workers share this story of hope, of how youth can and do find liberation and meaningful lives. We can hold this hope in attention alongside the heartbreak and the rage of the youth who has died. Sarah Ann says to me, "The Creator sent you to us and our families today." And I say, "The Creator also sent you to me today." Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Vicki. So wonderful to have you here, and just all of the reminders that you shared about our privilege and power and responsibilities in addressing gender-based violence, and also the messy and imperfect work of decolonizing the nonprofit sector. And those reminders that staying ethical and that can help us to sustain ourselves in this work, and our collective care that continue to help us to continue to bring hope to the people that we serve. So thank you so, so much. We have time for questions, about 15 minutes. So I know that Wendy's going to pop some questions in from the live stream. So if folks do have questions, please feel free to ask those now, and I'll direct those over to you. In the meantime, maybe I can ask you, you talked about collective care and solidarity teams. I wonder if you could say more about this and how that's been for you.
Oh, okay. Well, you know what? You can't keep yourself alive in this work alone. We need to have solidarity. I think that's what feminism is too, right? This idea that it's not personal, right? It's political, it's connective. So if you look on my website, I have some videos about solidarity teams, exercises, and articles. But basically, thinking intentionally about who are the people, experiences, places that shoulder you up in this work and hold you together in this work. You know, I've got a tattoo of an octopus right here. It looks like an anchor, but there's an octopus here. That octopus is part of my solidarity team. When I was sexually assaulted when I was young, when I went away to university and left my clan, I was held down a couple of times, and I really developed, claustrophobia. I went to therapy enough, and I found out, oh, okay, this claustrophobia is about being held down. I got it, enough therapy, it was useful. But then I realized, when I'm sitting in front of a person of any gender who's suffered sexual assault and they're telling me about rape, and I get as afraid as they do. Remember what I said, that self-care helps you get out of the way so it can be about them. Collective care helps you stay in and refuse to abandon that person. Refuse to go to your own pain. And so, octopus, I don't know if you know this, but they can escape absolutely anything. You can't trap an octopus. Have you seen those videos where they get out of things and they go, like, if they just have one little bone and if they can get that through, they escape? My octopus is right here, so that when I'm talking to somebody, I'm looking them in this octopus, I'm looking them in the eye. And so when I get scared and I start to get with claustrophobia and being held down because of my experiences of gender-based violence, this octopus in solidarity says to me, Vicki, you shouldn't even be here. Like, how many of us, seriously, Kate, should even be alive? You shouldn't even be here, and yet you're alive because you've never not escaped. And you're going to get out of this one, and you're going to take this woman with you. You're going to take this young person, this two-spirit person with you, right? So that's how my octopus is on my solidarity team. It reminds me of everybody that holds me together and has held me together ever since I had those experiences as a teenager, right? But I also have people that I call. you know, who would come and be right with me. And then there's people I hold connected to me and bring their, but like there's also water, you know, like there's experience, like whenever I'm a swimmer. So whenever I float in the ocean and look up at the sky, I think about how Mother Earth is holding me up. Mother Earth is on my solidarity team. We're not meant to do this work alone. Self-care is extremely limited. What are our practices of collective care, of holding each other to account, having the moral courage to offer each other critiques, keeping each other ethical, you know? Yeah, and to do that with intention. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Another question, when we're working in such tough spaces and difficult situations, how do we allow ourselves to feel lightness and tap into that resilience?
That's work. That's really tough work. I'm thinking right now about Tara Danger Taylor, like just an icon in the downtown east side. Tara is so important to me. She's on my solidarity team. They're queer and gender diverse, and they have run so many, are part of so many acts of resistance, community resistance in the downtown east side. You know, when our hearts are on the ground and people, you know, when you're just, somebody gets done, you know, when you're just like so screwed over by systems, by the cops, by these, yeah, in particular, the police, the way they're attacking drug users, responding to the overdose prevention site and attacking peer workers and stuff, and terrifying people, you know, and those kind of things happen, and we fail to get like simple procedures passed, and, you know, and you're just at the end of your tether, as it were. One of the things Tara does is goes to all the fruit and vegetable stores on Commercial Drive in East Van and gets all their melons and watermelons and squashes and stuff, and takes people to the park. And then they play, she just has you at the plate, Kate, and you've got a bat. And then she says, what's this melon? What is it? And you're saying, you know, that's the city council that wouldn't let us have a women's shelter. And you throw it, you just bash that grapefruit, or it's not a grapefruit because they don't smash really well. You know, think about a papaya going. There are ways to have our acts of resistance being collective and light and physical in the body and joyful. One of the things that I do also with Tara, and we did with Corey Kelly, an Indigenous woman who passed a year ago. We lost Corey, but we would run fires in the backyard. I rent a house in East Van, and my landlord's cool, and I've got a backyard that you can have a fire at. And we invite people to the warmth of a fire where we get together, and sometimes people cry and sometimes people keen. People read poems, people talk about people they've lost. We shoulder each other up. Sometimes people play accordions. You know, like we have to intentionally create these moments of connection and solidarity with each other. And finding that believed in hope is it's a real practice, and it's hard, isn't it? Like me running into Sarah Ann that morning, isn't that amazing? You know, there were many, many stories. There's many ways I could have told myself the story of those days. Instead, I just tell myself the story of my connection with her and her resistance across 2 decades, not just a resistance of drugs and alcohol, taking advantage of the gender-based violence she experienced, but also her ability to resist the government apprehending her children. Like, so there's just so much there to be hopeful about, you know, like it's a practice, and you can't do it alone. Again, this is collective care, right? What's really cool is Sarah Ann said that I saved her life. That's why I started choking up, because we've just lost so many people recently. But the reality is she saved mine. You know, like her telling me that 20 years later lets me know I have not wasted my life, that my work has mattered, and I just think for everybody listening to this, who's your Sarah Ann? Who is someone right now who's saying, oh my God, if it wasn't for Kate, I don't know. You know, you really kept me. I feel that in my body, you know, I feel that in my body.
Thank you. There's a few comments that have come in. I just wanted to share those with you. One participant saying, such a beautiful story and wonderful reminder of the importance of hope. I find myself feeling inspired by how you weave together social justice and trauma-focused work. Someone else shared, I wish I had better words to say how grateful and inspired I am by your words. Thank you, Vicki, for everything you bring to this work. And someone saying that they just like to say that your passion in your stories, all of us can relate to you, and thanks for reinforcing our beliefs. Another question that came in was wondering if you could elaborate more on the believed in hope somebody really wanting to apply this more.
I just want to go back a little bit. Can you read that last comment someone sent? There was something in there.
Just about being able to relate to you and, or
They said something about emotion or.
I wish I had better words to say how grateful and inspired I am. Thank you for bringing everything you bring to this work and your passion in the stories.
The passion. So I want to say something about that. How many of us have not been vilified, diagnosed, right, and seen as unprofessional for our passion? I get choked up because things still move me. If the story of Sarah Ann doesn't move me, I won't tell it again. I just think, you know, I'm all for professionalism. I have a PhD and I'm a registered clinical counselor. And when I was a professor, like there needs to be standards. I'm for all that. But think about how much privilege that keeps. Like I said, the gender-based violent movement, you know, because I'm white and good at school, even though I was poor, that school was a way out for me. That's accessed me to be able to respond to gender-based violence. And I think about everybody whose privilege I'm standing on was not welcome into the room, right? And I think we want to be really careful about resisting these ideas of professionalism because they're white patriarchal practices. This idea that you're not supposed to be emotional, you're supposed to have no emotion when you're talking about this stuff, you know, that I should keep it under wraps and kind of getting chokes okay, but tears would be too much. This is all policing and we're doing it to each other, right? And just thinking about how do we make room for all of us to have embodied responses? I really do live in my body. And I actually believe the way to stay alive in this work is to bring your whole body and soul and person to it, right? And to have that welcome. So how do we create spaces where, especially workers who are not white, older white women like me with a PhD, are able to show their emotionality, you know, and not have that pathologized or evidence that they're unprofessional. And I just wanted to say that. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks. Then that other question was about
the believed in hope and just applying that, applying it more. Yeah.
Well, okay. So vicarious trauma is actually based on the idea that clients infect us with their hopelessness. There's a this is the psychological basic analysis of it. There's a transmission. Some very known trauma experts talk about a transmission of traumatic shock from the woman who's been raped to the worker, and that's what happens to us. You know, I think that is absolutely wrong and unethical. The people I've seen who experienced sexualized violence are not the people that hurt me. It's the judges that say things like, keep your knees together. You know, it's Guillaume Gameshi getting off without ever even having to talk at his trial. And many, many women went to jail for protesting outside there. They were put on the ground by the cops and treated very rough. You know, and he didn't even have to answer a tough question, right? Aside from the 40 women who came forward and said he assaulted and raped them, right? That violence, you know, the fact that we all knew he would get off, not because he shouldn't. The justice system is the wrong thing. And Angela Davis says, right? Like that's a carceral response. I'm not looking to get more men in jail where they're at risk of being sexually assaulted. I'm against rape. I don't want anybody to get sexually assaulted, right? So, you know, how do you look for hope in those situations? Well, you look to decarceral movements. You look to abolition. You look to communities, queer communities, non-binary communities, trans communities, sex worker communities, refugee communities. I can name a million of them where people never call the cops. Direct action activist communities where we work collectively ourselves. We keep us safe, right? And, you know, like thinking about, there's so much hope in that. The idea that we haven't handed over our power to keep each other safe to the state. We're taking that on ourselves. Like, I just think the micro practices of hope are about looking for actions that tell you we are responding, we are resisting, you know? And again, I think the other thing is one of those tenets or understandings about resistance that I was talking about. Resistance doesn't just matter when it, quote, works. You know, a lot of people, if we look at the missing and murdered women's inquiry, you know, and I was part of Amnesty International decades ago, presenting No More Stolen Sisters, you know, and everybody saying, oh, none of those reports worked because, you know, nothing happened. It's not that nothing happened. You know, when the Tecumloops Sowetan people came out and said, we have found 215 children. They were believed because of 500 years of Indigenous resistance, right? All of those other actions started to build space in which this story of murdered and missing Indigenous children and the unmarked graves could be heard, right? So that's like, hope is hard work, but you've got to be able to see beyond. You have to see the connections of things, right? The solid, you know, the rhizome, the connections of things. And you can't do that alone. And I think the other thing about hope is honoring and witnessing and really celebrating each other and our resistance, you know? Yeah, really never lose an opportunity to, like Sarah Ann Mitchell telling me I saved her life. I know I didn't save her life. She saved her own life. The team was amazing, but you know, I was in there, right? That's hopeful. Never waste an opportunity to tell anybody resisting gender-based violence that their work matters. You know, it's small acts of living, as Goffman says, right? Yeah, quoting, you know, Alan Wade, you know, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good comment that leads this, kind of connects to this next question. Why do you think it's so hard for this sector to have solidarity? There are so many nonprofits that have terrible internal conflicts that take away from really being completely present with our clients.
Because we're under attack. We are under attack. If we were trying to still sell real estate, we would not be under attack. That's why we're having trouble. I don't believe in lateral violence. I don't think people are attacking each other. The attacks are coming from patriarchy. The attacks are coming from the cisgendered communities. The attacks are coming from people who perpetrate gender-based violence, right? We are under attack, right? And no one comes to work in gender-based violence who hasn't had experiences of oppression. I'm not saying we're broken, trashed workers who are traumatized or anything like that, but you know, many of us are raw and we've had real experiences. So I think, you know, I'll give you another analogy. I lived in Botswana in Africa. It's a country right north of South Africa. During apartheid, you know, when white supremacists in South Africa ruled and everything. Okay, and then they overthrew that, right? And they, you know, and the Republic of South Africa got past apartheid and was led by a black man. Within a couple of years of that, people were saying, wow, look at black on black violence in South Africa. Maybe they can't rule themselves. What's wrong with them? And they said, what's wrong with us is 500 years of white violence. This isn't black on black violence. These are all structures set up there. Could you give us a minute? And one of the things, I love the story this ambassador from South Africa told here when he was presenting at the Truth and Reconciliation Tribunal, and he said, you know, we've had 500 years of white supremacist state violence, terror, and torture. We've had like 3 years of black self-governance, and you expect us to be better. You know, it took us 500 years to cross the river. Now we have to climb the mountain. And I think that's where we are as well. Let's acknowledge we are still very much under attack, right? It's not a lack of solidarity. It's that so much of our resistance has to continually go to attack. Yesterday, I was on a ferry and there's not many people on it. And I went to go in the bathroom and I thought a man was going to follow me in there. I was fucking terrified. And there was nobody else on that floor. My partner was outside. My partner never has to think about that when he goes to the bathroom. That's still going on in my body as I gave my keynote today. I might have been, he really scared me yesterday. That guy did scare me. And I think he was after me. And I think I did have to do some things to resist him, seriously. And you know what? That's still going in my body as I gave my keynote today. That's why people would say, oh, this is why, you know, men are so much more professional. And they wouldn't have broken up as they told the story. You know, part of the reason I was shaky is I'm shaky because we have not delivered on a just society and we're walking around with targets on us. That's why. And differential targets. I don't mean to say I'm as much at risk as an Indigenous woman, a poor woman, a woman with disabilities, right? Kate, I hope that wasn't too much of a ramble.
Thank you for sharing that, and of course, sorry that happened to you. And that reminder of, you know, how much we are in our bodies is so important. I do want to just share one comment before we close from some participant, and I know there's many questions and comments coming in that we don't have time for, but just somebody wanted to say thank you for your perspectives. They've provided me with areas for additional reflection. Additionally, thank you for sharing, and please thank Sarah Mitchell for the story of hope. It brought tears to my eyes. So on behalf of EVA BC, Vicki, I do want to thank you for joining us again this year. And thanks everyone for listening and participating this morning.
Thanks so much. Really honored to be here.
Thank you.